Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Kevin Zongzi Lee. I am an affiliated researcher with the Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis, and you are joining us at the China-ASEAN at a Crossroads, Navigating Regional Futures in an Era of Great Power Competition webinar. We are very pleased to be joined today by three very distinguished guests. Pak Gita Warjawan, who is the former Minister of Trade of Indonesia, joining us from the Bay Area. Good morning, Pak Gita. Bert Hoffman, Professor Bert Hoffman from a National University of Singapore, who's also an honorary senior fellow on Chinese economy with the CCA, joining us from Jakarta. Welcome, Bert. And Professor Brian Won, who's an assistant professor in philosophy from the University of Hong Kong, who's also an honorary fellow of the CCA, joining us from Hong Kong. So across 4 time zones, very much appreciate everyone's convening to this very timely discussion around China and Southeast Asia, China and ASEAN. This has been a very interesting week. China just hosted the 4th plenum, which unveiled the architecture and overview of the new 5-year economic plan for the country. We had a variety of agreements and joint statements already coming out of the ASEAN summit hosted in Kuala Lumpur, but we're also expecting a possible President Xi and President Trump conversation and meeting to occur in person in South Korea on Thursday of this coming week. So with that, at this pivotal juncture for Southeast Asia, as Chinese investments flow into the region, as the region grapple with a more volatile economic and geopolitical order, with domestic transition still occurring through different parts of Southeast Asia, new layers of uncertainties and complexities have built up. And for this conversation, we aim to unpack a bit of what the summit has achieved. What are some of the signals to look out for the future of China-ASEAN relations? Questions around, can the region sustain its ability to remain united, to continue to hold on to agency amid rising competition and uncertainties, and how could the region chart a cooperative path forward? For the first 15 minutes, I will turn to the panelists to give us some opening reflections before we go on to moderated discussions amongst the 4 of us. I would like to invite Pak Gita Warjawan to give us a high-level reflection to begin with on ASEAN's geopolitical landscape in 2025, and then we'll move on to Professor Bert Hoffman and Professor Brian Wong for reflections around economics and security and governance. So Pak Gita, over to you. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to emphasize that Southeast Asia has been really good at embracing multipolarity for the last 2,000 years. This is on the back of its having been graced by religious, cultural, economic, and civilizational forces or influences from different parts of the world, namely India, China, and the Arabian Peninsula. And it's gone through a renaissance and series of episodic stresses in the last 2,000 years. Fast forward to 1955, I think it was very clear when Sukarno, Zhou Enlai, Nehru, and Nasser congregated in Bandung to assert the spirit of anti-colonialism or anti-neocolonialism, also with the additional views of trying to bring about peace between India and China, peace between China and the US, and also for support for Indonesia's effort to consolidate its eastern parts. This, I think, would have been further projected in the non-aligned movement in Yugoslavia, then hosted by Tito, and recently Southeast Asia's ability to basically embrace frameworks that would have been deemed as China-centric or Western-centric. Call it the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership or the CPTPP or the OECD or the APEC or the BRICS. This, I think, reflects upon Southeast Asia's recognition of how the world has and will continue to change. But it's, I think, important now to highlight that the changes are highly likely to be much more exponential as they relate to ecology, climate, technology, geopolitics, and economics. Now, as of last year, Southeast Asia's economic relations with China would have been around $1 trillion in terms of goods and services being traded by each other. That between Southeast Asia and the US would have been around $530 billion. We can be presumptuous of the train leaving the station with China at a higher velocity and acceleration. But I'm in the camp that views increasingly that I think the way Southeast Asia would have to look at China, I think would have to be for much more technological capital allocation purposes. And this is on the back of the divergent economic attainment in Southeast Asia, given the fact that some countries earn less than $2,000, one country earns more than $90,000. Given such divergence, I think they can only afford technological capital that's much cheaper than that procured by the West. Whereas we have to increasingly look at the West for economic capital allocation purposes. This may sound paradoxical given how the economic relations between Southeast Asia and the US might look compared to how Southeast Asia's economic relations have been, are, and are likely to be with China. Now, I think given the increasing global fragmentation or decoupling or divorce or what have you between China and the West or the US, I think it's important to also emphasize that the centrality of Southeast Asia needs to be harnessed, if not enriched. One way to do that, I think, is to absolutely and resolutely take a look at or take a view on reducing the pre-existing educational divergence, which I think is highly correlated with the economic attainment divergence. This is reflected in how Singapore has been able to score really well at the non-tertiary level and also at the tertiary level, whereas the other 8 or 9 countries, or now 11 countries, given the fact that Timor-Leste has just joined, do not score nearly as well as Singapore has. Now, I'm also advocating increasingly for relooking at the pre-existing principle of subsidiarity at ASEAN. This is the regional organization which has emphasized the principle of non-interference or the principle of subsidiarity. I'm a believer of that, but I'm also a believer that to the extent that we keep relying on the individual government to promote and harness and better its pre-existing educational capability, I think it'll be very, very hard for the future of Southeast Asia or ASEAN to maintain, if not promote, its pre-existing centrality. Now, can this be done? I do believe that, pragmatically speaking, it will require the Singaporeans to concede or to agree to its pre-existing best practice in education to be somewhat emulated or copycatted with or for the other 9 or 10 countries, of course, with differentiated timelines. Now, I think the other natural force in Southeast Asia that would have to force this or encourage this to be promoted by all the other members of Southeast Asia would have to be Indonesia, given the fact that it's around 43% of the collective GDP and collective economy of Southeast Asia. This is, I think, a necessary conversation that needs to be held by not just the elites, but I think by the non-elites, so that we can also bottom up the need for us to reduce the pre-existing educational divergence and also reduce the economic divergence so that we can deal with the superpowers of China and the West in a much more harmonious manner going forward.
Thank you very much, Pakita, for helping us situate ourselves in Southeast Asia and thinking from the ground up. I'd like to invite Bert now for your opening reflections. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. I make a note that I am largely thinking about China, but I now live in Indonesia, so I do have a bit of an ASEAN perspective. And from that perspective, frankly, a lot of people around the world are talking about the China plus one strategy. Well, ASEAN is the China plus one strategy for China. It's very clear that over the past 10 years, the alignment economically has become very strong, but not just economically. And if you look at the numbers that were just published, as a matter of fact, formally they're launched tomorrow by Lee Kuan Yew School on overall alignment, US versus China, clearly ASEAN has been moving in the direction, all ASEAN countries have been moving in the direction of China, most prominently economically, but not just economically, also diplomatically, culturally, or soft power wise, a much clearer alignment with China for all countries. The exception to the alignment is still strategic and military, and I know Brian is going to talk about that, so I won't talk about that. In part, the battle between China and the US has been reinforcing this trend of the China plus one strategy is ASEAN. Clearly, ASEAN is now the top destination for China's exports, as ASEAN's top destination is China. China is growing very, very rapidly, but in part, and rapidly, almost too rapidly, because they're running surpluses with each and every country in ASEAN. But the saving grace is there that quite a bit of that trade is transit trade. And that was, of course, induced by Trump 1, now reinforced by Trump 2, where with the high tariffs on China, it becomes beneficial to channel some of the exports through Southeast Asia. Vietnam is a big beneficiary, Thailand to some extent. That's on the trade side. On the investment side, equally, quite a strong shift of Chinese investments toward Southeast Asia. If you want, in the 2000s, there was a lot of resource-based foreign direct investments coming from China, a lot of it to Africa, quite a bit of it to Middle East and other countries. In the 2010s, there was a lot of intellectual property-related IP investment coming from China, quite a bit directed towards Europe, quite a bit directed towards the United States. But ASEAN has now become, if you want, the big winner over the past 3-4 years. ASEAN is the largest destination of Chinese FDI. And yes, it's infrastructure. Yes, it's mining, but increasingly it's also manufacturing. So really what you see emerging is a much stronger intra-regional network, economically, trade and investment in the whole of East Asia, with the China-ASEAN axis at the core. Diplomatically, you see, of course, the RCEP that has been concluded. Frankly, not that important yet. Nobody seems to be using RCEP except maybe in Northeast Asia. But to get, if you want, the most East Asian players on one page, Korea, Japan, China, ASEAN, was a very important breakthrough. There is still CPTPP as being the more ambitious level, the more modern level trade agreement that China is now aspiring to. Some ASEAN members are already a member, and that could be, if you want, the convergence between RCEP and CPTPP, the Japan-led effort of trade integration, I think will be the next phase, which will again only reinforce these production networks in East Asia. So overall, a very important and positive development for Southeast Asia, as well as for China. The apple cart can still be upturned. We will find out what the tariffs will be on China after Trump's meeting with Xi Jinping at the end of the month in Korea. And that's now very important, because right now the effective tariffs on China are 55%. They're not prohibitive, but they're high. And the average tariffs on ASEAN countries is about 20%. If those get closer together, say if China also ends up with 20%, the development that you have seen in the past, strong investments in manufacturing in Southeast Asia coming from China, and a lot of transit trade, that might take a step back because of the reduction in tariff differences. But we'll see. We'll know by the end of the month.
Thank you, Bert. I think a lot of very good numbers, and I think we'll unpack that just a bit more in the discussions to follow. Let me just quickly turn to Professor Brian Wong now to perhaps touch on a bit of strategy, a bit of governance, and maybe a bit of security as well between China and Southeast Asia.
Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure and honor to be here amongst such esteemed panelists and dear friends. I think a key point to note is that when it comes to security situation on the ground and also the relationship between China and ASEAN security-wise, things are far less rosy as they are in the economic or commercial or supply chain domain, or even in the renewable space as well, as I'm sure we'll talk about later on. And that is for what I call the 3 S's that stand as obstacles to the deepening of Sino-ASEAN security ties. The first is the most obvious elephant in the room, the South China Sea. That's the first S, where approximately 3.4 trillion in global trade passes through the region, and that's around 1/3 worth of global maritime trade. We're talking here about approximately 80% of China's energy imports, 40% of its trade going through the South China Sea. And in the eyes of course, key decision makers in Beijing, they would say that the SCS matters not just as a matter of symbolism or pride, which really is secondary as a consideration to the economic, commercial, and ultimately supply chain security considerations in relation to why they see the region as so indispensable, just as all the other interested stakeholders, of course, in the SCS. And that includes the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, and of course, when it comes to the cross-straits dynamic, you've got the Chinese mainland and also Taiwan, each having their own claims over this very contested plot of the Earth's ocean, which really is quite small in the grand scheme of things, and yet so substantial in terms of strategic heft and weight. The truth of the matter is, despite the UNCLOS ruling and despite all of the bilateral and multilateral attempts that have been advanced by various parties over the past 40 years, there's yet to be a genuine resolution framework that's amenable to all of these disputing parties over the SCS. And it is also for that reason that many of the more prominent maritime powers in ASEAN, including Vietnam, the Philippines, and also to some extent Indonesia, they've been wary of pursuing, security alignment and partnerships in a fundamental sense with China, simply in virtue of the directly confrontational and opposed interests over this part of the world. The second consideration, though, that I'm going to lay on the table, besides the elephant in the room, concerns stability. And here I'm going to throw out a couple of examples. The changes in government in Thailand over the past 10 years, or what we saw, very briefly in relation to the Sheraton move, of course, in Malaysia, or even, of course, in relation to the ongoing civil strife and civil war that we've seen raging on, of course, in Myanmar as we speak today. Stability is a key concern, not just for ASEAN countries and their many, many peoples, but also for the prospects of genuine Sino-ASEAN economic partnerships, knowing that your investments and your, the commitments of capital towards pipelines, for instance, are not going to be disrupted by terrorist groups, are not going to be taken hostage of by local warlords, or indeed fall prey to an inept government that decides to sort of push back. That's from the Chinese point of view, but from the point of view of local stakeholders, knowing that your own lands are not taken or appropriated by what you perceive to be essentially outside forces colluding with domestic elite to trample your own territorial rights. These are all perceptual dynamics that are shaping the reticence on both sides of the equation in terms of pursuing enduring and also structured economic partnerships. And here, of course, I'm looking at the substantial energy pipelines and also critical raw material supply, that the sort of supply chain that goes on between China and Myanmar, but also transportation infrastructure such as the East Coast Railway, of course, that was proposed, and then over which Mahathir, during his second term, initially pushed back and then renegotiated terms, only for Muhyiddin and again his successor Ismail Sabri to propose slightly different variants of terms and arrangements. In the eyes of investors on both sides of the equation, such instability is not conducive towards economic partnerships or indeed supply chain realignments as sustainable. And just a final note then, and that's the third S that I'll stop on, is sectarian strife. Whether it be the sort of secessionist pro-independence movements that you observe in southern Philippines, or the kind of terrorist activities on the borders between Thailand and Malaysia, and of course, the cross-border criminal syndicate gangs operating in Myanmar and Cambodia and also Thailand, which kind of contributed towards, the very infamous fallout that we saw earlier this year between the two governments of Thailand and Cambodia. These are all manifestations of, sectarian, alternatively nominally civilianly led, but ultimately state-backed or to some extent state endorsed, or state abetted forms of cross-national crimes that have destabilizing effects on regional security that ultimately, first and foremost, harm ASEAN populations. It undermines the country's reputations, it disrupts their lives, and it also renders much harder for the people and also businesses on the ground to convince external investors from China, but also from other countries, to come and settle along these frontier, or what I call border and also disequilibrium zones, so to speak. So the three S's, SES, stability or lack thereof, and sectarian strife, these are very tricky problems, without the addressing of which I don't foresee a massive amelioration and improvement in a warmth of security ties between China and ASEAN.
Thank you very much, Professor Brian, for the three S's, help us think in frameworks and layers. And thank you all for the opening reflections. I think for the typical listenership of the Center for China Analysis, this is a great overview of what's going on between China and Southeast Asia. So I would now like to open up to moderated discussions, and I would like to invite the participants to submit questions. You should be able to see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen where you can submit a question, and at the end of the panel, we'll go back in there and select a few that are most interesting and most relevant and throw these at our panelists. So please do submit your questions. And with that overview, I think to help us situate ourselves in Southeast Asia, can consider yourself as an Indonesian, as a Singaporean, as a Laotian person, the overarching, overwhelming effect or the role of the influence of China. We're getting a little bit of these on-the-ground observations and signals. I would like to turn back to Pak Gita and hear from your involvement, your work, your most recent book, which is, I believe, What It Takes for Southeast Asia to Rise. I can't paraphrase exactly the title, but I wanted to tap into your observations and knowledge and hear a little bit about kind of your observations around what you described as ASEAN centrality, ASEAN strategic autonomy. We've noted the narrowing and the difficulties and the complexities of the international environment that ASEAN faces in terms of having to hedge or having to pick and choose or find alliances to, but ultimately, to what degree does ASEAN have that same room to navigate and to maneuver, or are we observing a lessening of space, a lessening of strategic choices for ASEAN to pick and choose, and they're being forced into these more sharper, more distinct sides and narratives? I would like to hear a bit about your experiences at Kuala Lumpur this weekend as well, and your latest thoughts on this.
As of late, I've been spending a lot more time with geologists. And the reason being, geologists can explain to me how the formation of a rock has taken place in the last 150 million years. And it compels me to think long term. I agree with, the remarks by Bert and Brian, but allow me to just re-emphasize the peace and stability of Southeast Asia for the last 2,000 years, in spite of the gracing of various civilizational forces. And empirically, there's no more than 9 million lives lost in the last 2,000 years on the back of differences of views or opinions with regards to sovereignty, religion, race, or ethnicity. Compare that with Europe. I'm not going to quote the numbers. I think Bert knows it. But just in the first two world wars, we're looking at more than 100 million lives lost. And it adds up to close to 190 million lives during the same 2,000-year duration. So I think most Southeast Asians do not understand the richness of our history. And a lot of this is because of how influences from outside would have been socialized as opposed to proselytized, with the exception of the last 3.5 centuries of humiliation. But put that aside, as it regards to the lack of stability, the lack of sectarian stability or cohesiveness in the South China Sea, those are episodic stresses, right? Now, the mood in Kuala Lumpur a couple of days when I was there, I think was of recognition that the fragmentation of the world is only going to heighten. Now, for Southeast Asians to deal with that is to really be able to converge educationally, because by way of an increasing degree of educational convergence, I'll give you some empirical evidence. Cambodia scores 81 on the PISA rankings out of 81 countries. Indonesia, 69. Singapore, number 1. Vietnam, number 33. Such divergence is not going to help Southeast Asia, right? As it has to deal with the growing fragmentation of the world order, call it the refined multipolarity or bipolarity. And I do believe that to the extent that we can reduce the pre-existing divergence of educational attainment, we can reduce the pre-existing economic divergence. It's not going to help the Laotians, Cambodians, and Myanmaris when they only earn less than $2,000, when the Singaporeans are concocting a framework with the most elites or the most sophisticated economies in the world. I was one of the initiators of RCEP. I rejected the TPP, not because I didn't understand the framing of the TPP, because I didn't think it was going to be applicable to most parts of Indonesia, similarly most parts of Southeast Asia, who didn't understand what intellectual property was, who didn't understand what human rights ought to be applied like, who didn't understand government procurement ought to be like. So it boils down to how you're going to be able to sell the framework to the very bottom of the pole when it comes to educational attainment. Now, as it relates to economic partnership between China and Southeast Asia, call it the BRI. The reason why the BRI is not as robust as it would have been aspired. The target for Southeast Asia would have been about $800 billion in 2013. The realization thus far has only been about $80 billion. It's not because of the lack of desire by the Chinese. It's not because of the lack of desire by the Southeast Asians, but it's the lack of accountability on the receiving end. And it's the lack of understanding of how to actually socialize what needs to be done for remedying the pre-existing, not disaster, but disillusionment. Now, I think there is a way to fix this. The way to fix this is to actually enrich the cultural connectivity between Southeast Asia and China. And this could be easily manifested in how we should, the number of student representation of Chinese in Southeast Asia and the number of student representation of Southeast Asians in China. It's not to the level where it needs to be. If we really want to promote the pre-existing, relations economically and technologically. Now, lastly, I just want to say that, can the Laotians, Myanmaris, and Cambodians afford an iPhone? They can't. They can only afford an Oppo. The Singaporeans can very well afford an iPhone because they earn more than $90,000. I think it's far more important for Southeast Asians to reduce the divergence so that they can promote a much better centrality, so that they can better understand the framing by either the Chinese or anybody else, around the world before we, start worrying about all these episodic stresses that have been alluded to earlier.
Thank you very much, Pak Gita. And just a follow-up question for you, since you've served in the capacity as a cabinet member of the Indonesian government, what is the role that you envisioned Indonesia, the leadership, the convening, what role is it that Indonesia can play for ASEAN in its relationship management, in its engagement with great powers like China or the US?
Well, Indonesia represents about 43% of the GDP and population of Southeast Asia. But we also know that Singapore is the intellectual capital of Southeast Asia, admittedly, right? So I think for ASEAN or Southeast Asia to be able to embrace any type of influence from anywhere, including China and the West, it requires the understanding of the Singaporeans and the Indonesians, right? And the role of Indonesia, I think, to assert the pulse of the developing nature of the region, whereas the role of the Singapore is to assert the pulse of the developed nature. I think a combination of both, I think, is a compelling combination for the region to harness a much better future as it relates to the rest of the world.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to turn that to Professor Bert Hoffman, who straddles between Singapore and Jakarta, and ask you not the same question, but perhaps your observations on especially the economic side of things. One of my burning questions that I always try to understand when I go to Southeast Asia is the Chinese impact. You've spoken quite a bit with regards to the positivity, with regards to FDIs, with regards to trade. A lot of lingering concerns, though, have to do a lot with what Pak Gita mentioned as accountability issues, credibility issues, environmental, social, and governance. I would love to hear a bit with regards to that, how you see that, and how ASEAN is looking to leverage its own regional integration, its own ability to trade amongst itself, to build up its economic positioning in the broader sense with regards to the global economy.
Well, thanks, Kevin. But I will also make use at the prodding of Gita of being a European, because there's actually quite a bit of lessons I think ASEAN can learn from the EU. And if you look at the very early days of the EU, the big outsider was the US. And the US was the massive investor in Europe, and they bought up all the companies, and it was a big concern, and there was lots of, if you want, trepidation around this US involvement. It disappeared because in the end it turned out to be quite beneficial. But in the short term, of course, there were concerns because all these American goods coming in and we can't rebuild our own industries after the war. Something similar like that is to some extent in ASEAN. Because yes, one of the features of China's exports is something quite unusual. They're actually, yes, they're investing more in manufacturing, particularly in automotives, in some of the more sensitive areas, automotives and solar and others that are sort of sensitive to geopolitical tensions. But China continues to export at the lower end of the, if you want, the production schedule. So the textiles, the toys, the furniture, something where some Southeast Asian countries, particularly the poorer ones, would have a comparative advantage compared to China. China keeps on exporting, maintaining or even increasing its market share in the world. And that's in part because of automation, in part because of efficiency gains in China. And it's quite scary for some countries. And therefore you see that some of the trade actions against China, yes, we have the EU, yes, we have the US, but they actually come from developing countries, including ASEAN countries, because they are afraid of a deindustrialization because of China. And I think China should be a bit more aware of that. And I'm just reading into this, but if I look in the fine print of the fourth plenum communique, I think it reflects that concern a little bit. So we may want to see some action down the road that is a bit more balanced trade. But in the long term, these investments from China are a real opportunity for ASEAN countries. Now, coming to the integration, they could be even better. And and with all due respect to Pak Gita, the history of ASEAN it's an association of countries. It's the ASEAN way. It's the consensus. But the economic consequence is that it's a hub and spoke model led by outsiders. And it used to be Japan, then it was a little bit Korea, now it's China, that has very good relationships with individual ASEAN countries, but they're the integrators. They're the hub. And so almost naturally, the greatest benefit from those relationships maybe comes to China. If ASEAN were to be the economic union that it was supposed to be, they could be viable hubs by themselves. They could be industrial hubs by themselves with, some of the production in Indonesia, some of the production in Thailand, all organized by Singaporeans. That's not possible at the moment. That's not possible. And that's a real downside for ASEAN. So they could benefit a lot more if their own integration were to accelerate in the current time frame. Frankly, I think this is a real opportunity for ASEAN to move ahead in that direction. Thanks.
Thank you, Bert. Very, very intriguing parallelism between US, EU, and ASEAN, China today. One of the questions in the Q&A wanted to take a stab at to what extent do you believe is the technology cooperation, especially between renewable energies, battery technology, perhaps even solar and wind, present such opportunity for mutual growth? Or is that too simple of a way to look at this tech transfer between China and Southeast Asia, especially around the clean energy value chain? And what are some of the obstacles to this?
I can comment on that. Brian, you want to take a stab at it, or you're okay?
No, Pakita, feel free to just supplement you later with my thoughts.
I think Bert and I are actually not in disagreement. My earlier point about the educational attainment divergence is the structural issue and the reason as to why we're at the mercy of the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, and the Americans, as a result of which, the centrality is not there. The integration is not there. Take a look at the intra-trade. It's only 23% of the collective GDP as opposed to the EU's more than 60%. It just means that we're not telling stories to each other in a more educated manner, in a more intellectual manner. And that, I think, is attributable to the structural, reason of this lack of educational attainment convergence. Now, as it relates to renewables, the technology is there, but unfortunately, it can only be procured at a cost of 15 cents, whether we're looking at geothermal, hydro, wind, or nuclear, or what have you, or even higher. But unfortunately, the global south could only afford 5 cents on a per kilowatt hour. So how do you deal with that gap between 15 cents and 5 cents? I'm a believer of the fact and the possibility that 15 cents is going to come down faster than that 5 cents going up, because we're seeing so much political neurosis in many parts of the world, particularly the developing economies. Now, I think there needs to be a view taking by a developed economy as to, try to remedy or figure out how to remedy that gap between 15 cents and 5 cents. But as it is, I think the Chinese are capable and able of procuring technology much more efficiently and effectively than the West. The Chinese, as of today, I think are a lot more 1 to the next digit as opposed to the West being 0 to 1. But whatever digit the West procures, it's not affordable for the Laotians, Cambodians, and Myanmaris, and to some extent the Indonesians. So I think, going forward, the Southeast Asians will have to look at China more for technological capital allocation purposes. Now, in terms of the opportunity for reshoring or of offshoring of technological capability from China to Southeast Asia beyond textile, I think it's doable, and it's happening not on the back of, the increasing marginal productivity of Southeast Asians, but it's on the back of the Chinese elites realizing and recognizing that they can actually make more money in Southeast Asia, producing in Southeast Asia. This is manifested in BYD's opening in Thailand and BYD's soon to be opening in Kupang in West Java. And that, I think, is not on the back of some, circumvention around the rules of origin or on the back of, the blowbacks and whatever. So the Chinese recognize that it's a lot more competitive to produce goods and services in China than it is in Southeast Asia. I think the long run, it has to be in such a narrative that, there has to be some effort, if not a high degree of effort by the Chinese or any outsiders for Southeast Asians to move up the value chain, to move up the global geopolitical order by way of the reduction of the pre-existing educational divergence. Now, lastly, I'll just say, Southeast Asia produces about 750,000 STEM products per year. China, 4.5 million. India, 2.5 million. There's no way Southeast Asia is going to be able to be competitive if it continues producing only 750,000 STEM products per year. That denominator needs to go up to at least 2 million if it ever wants to be competitive to anybody around the world. Now, by way of doing that, I think Southeast Asia has a much better chance of trading with each other, trading with the rest of the world, moving up the value chain and moving up the global geopolitical order.
Thank you, Pakita. Bert, over to you.
Yeah, so let me just add, because I have no disagreement with this. I think you can almost formulate this as an ask to China, i.e., if those partnerships were to continue and if this integration were to continue, then one of the ask of ASEAN would be to have that technology transfer. And funny enough, that is exactly what China did in the early 80s towards their own foreign partners that came in with FDI. And of course, in the beginning, technology transfer was not an issue, training was not an issue. So that would also alleviate a lot of the concerns around employment, a lot of concerns around external influence of China in the local economy. China is not quite there yet. And if you look at their most recent regulations on technologies, on battery technology, on solar technology, and then, of course, on rare earth technologies, they seem to be wanting to hog the technologies and not transfer it and be very concerned about that transfer. That's something that would need to be debated, and as I said, it can best be put in an ask from ASEAN countries towards their main, one of their main foreign investment. I should say one of their main. Japan is still very big. The US is still not trivial. They're still very present in Southeast Asia, but an up-and-coming foreign investor like China. It would be very productive for both sides.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Bert, and thank you, Gita. I'd like to keep moving and head towards Professor Brian Wong. And Brian, I understand you look at not just Southeast Asia, but also AI and AI geopolitics. And one of my burning questions was, as AI becomes more intertwined with the region, with economic competitiveness, productivity, how might Southeast Asia navigate the emerging AI geopolitics between US, China, and perhaps the EU as well? And does the region has its own agency to, for instance, set standards, foster innovation, or leverage such for economic development, and rather than simply being a passive adopter of systems developed by others?
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. I'm just taking in like a sponge the discussion thus far, because I think it really does feed into my answers here. And in short, I've again got 3 prongs to my answer. And the first is the role of ASEAN as a semi-porous membrane. The second concerns ASEAN as a norm guiding and shaping region, ? And the third is the very realistic deficiencies and challenges that lie ahead, tying or connected with, of course, Pakita's book on, just to give you a preview, the extent to which the region is actually electrified or has access to stable and consistent supply of electricity, which is a serious challenge and question, especially as LM, large language model development, progresses down the curve, so to speak. So firstly, on the semi-porous membrane concept, when we speak of the AI world or landscape today, we tend to paint the world through lenses of a binary. We say there's the China-centered sphere, there's a US-centered sphere, and then, of course, my European friends would say, hey, where are we? Where are we? Where are we? And then some folks would say, you belong with the Americans, and others would say you belong nowhere. And then, of course, some would say, or I would say, actually, you could belong somewhere if only you'd start punching at or above your weight. But anyway, that's an aside. So we grant that ultimately a large number of tech companies working on the frontiers of AI model development are indeed in China and the US. Does that therefore leave ASEAN bereft of agency? I think not. Because if you think about it, right, whether it be in terms of advanced chips, here I'm not talking about legacy chips, I'm talking about cutting edge chips produced by NVIDIA, so to speak. Where can you find them? Often in the most unexpected of places. And very often you'd find that despite the best efforts of US federal agencies to crack down upon the illicit exporting of chips from, of course, US mainland through to a list of geopolitical adversaries and rivals, including but not limited to China, How do these chips end up in the hands of Chinese manufacturers and also Chinese firms, so to speak? Well, very often it's via the routes in ASEAN, the likes of Malaysia or Singapore or Indonesia to some extent. And of course, that's become a sticking point in, the American government's approach to export controls and the sort of small yard, high fence approach to the extent that, of course, they've included transshipment restrictions as well as the AI diffusion rule, and that was incorporated by Biden as a parting gift before he stepped down, only for the rule to be revoked 4 months later by Donald J. Trump. But in short, ASEAN is porous in that regard, and despite the best efforts of all parties to enforce and crack down on smugglers, so to speak, that's not going to happen, because you might crack down on one, but it'll just reestablish an outfit elsewhere in exactly the same country, leveraging the flexibility and fluidity afforded to them by the geography of ASEAN, so to speak. The second observation, too, is the porousness of data restrictions and talent restrictions. It might be possible to require that talents working, in an American headquartered company could never travel to China and vice versa. And yet in ASEAN, talents meet organically. They engage, they collaborate, and that is also where ideas are spread, just as it was thousands of years ago in Batavia, of course, or alternatively on this little island of Run, which is again talked about as a product of exchange between, the Dutch and the Portuguese, so to speak. But that's an aside. The final comment on the porousness, though, is that ASEAN countries have agency when they realize how much weight and how much clout they actually have in certain critical respects. Indonesia is the world's largest producer of nickel, a very important component of electric vehicles. Vast swathes of critical minerals, not rare earths, but minerals, can be found in the Philippines, for instance, and of course in Myanmar, where some have posited that large deposits of rare earths are also to be found as well. If only the governments and the peoples were given, by extension, the opportunity to instrumentalize these resources as an asking price, to demand more from the great powers, then I would say in this era of hyper-transactional geopolitics, ASEAN countries certainly have a say. Very quickly then on the idea of norm setting, Singapore is incredible. Singapore is incredible because for an economy of its size and a population, with that population, it has managed to position itself with outsized authority and also visibility across many issues of global importance, including AI ethics and governance. You've seen some of the most prominent names in the Silicon Valley, but also big names in the Chinese academic spaces working on frontier AI, pulled to AI conferences in Singapore, drawn to AI summits, talking about AI safety in Singapore. And while some might say this is just a Singaporean government putting out the usual sort of, PR to get its name out there, to get its name on everything, say what you will of this tactic, it's actually working. And it's increasingly clear that ASEAN could well be an experimental ground for a more consociational and deliberative, model of AI governance and regulation that's perhaps more similar to the European in some regard in its regards for individual liberties, but also dissimilar and is less bogged down in bureaucracy. What exactly these standards are remain to be seen, but I certainly see a role and a space to be played and harnessed by ASEAN with regards to setting the norms on AI law, AI regulation, and also AI policing. But here's where the real bottleneck kicks in. Recognize that fundamentally the digital infrastructure in vast swathes of ASEAN remains deeply, deeply lacking. We don't have the power grid or stable power supply, an electric grid covering a vast majority of land area in Indonesia. And even where you see electricity supply through, say, hydroelectric sources, for instance, in Laos, in Cambodia, and also the other Mekong countries with thanks of the access to the Mekong River, by and large, access to electricity is very asymmetrically and unevenly distributed. Till the day we see a stable, consistent, and equitable and fair usage of electricity supported via, renewable and non-renewable sources alike, but preferably increasingly renewable sources, till that day comes, I'd say ASEAN would still struggle by and large with regards to AI incorporation and diffusion in physical infrastructure, especially in countries that are more struggling, economically, so to speak, amongst the 11 ASEAN members. So that's what I'd say there. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. I think it presents a tremendous opportunity to think of Southeast Asia not just as a taker, but also a shaper of emerging AI and geopolitics. we had a question in the chat that was trying to get at which book is it that Pagita has written. So I've actually just dropped a link into the chat box. It's called What It Takes for Southeast Asia to Go from the Periphery to the Core of Global Consciousness. So do take a look. We have about 10 minutes left, so I want to open up to some questions. And in fact, we've received quite a few already. There were two that were standing out to me, and I'm just going to share those out, and for any of our panelists to come in and present their quick takes. One centered heavily around the question of Timor-Leste joining ASEAN as the 11th member, and some would say completing the geographical picture of Southeast Asia. Some of our questions are concerning how will that change the balance of powers in the region? How will that change potentially some of the trade relations or security considerations between US and China in this region? And perhaps this is, will it test the coherence of Southeast Asia, of ASEAN as a platform and as a mechanism?
Timor-Leste, or East Timor previously, I think would have been very much a part of the Southeast Asian fabric, historically, sentimentally, and emotionally, and ethnically, right? So I think it's a natural augmentation to the pre-existing framework. Does it affect the coherence? I think it does to some extent, until and unless ASEAN takes a view. In my book, I specifically propose or advocate for some sort of a supranationalist type of posturing at ASEAN, not to the extent the EU is, but I think to the extent that it can actually impose upon its membership the adoption of a best practice of education, call it the Singaporean model, and then work out differentiated timelines, without which I think we're going to lose not only the coherence, but we're going to lose the convergence that's necessary as to deal with the highly fragmenting global order. I do believe that without that, even without Timor-Leste being consolidated at ASEAN, I think ASEAN might be at risk in dealing with the global challenges that are moving at a much more exponential rate as they relate to climate, technology, geopolitics, and economics. Now, the porous or lack of porous nature of ASEAN is largely because, one guy doesn't score well compared to the other guy, academically. And I think there needs to be some sort of convergence. I mean, they don't have to be scoring number one in the world, all of them. But if they're within a certain reasonable range, I think there's a much better chance for ASEAN to go forward and as to reduce that porosity that, Brian has alluded to. Now, lastly, with regards to energy, when you use your ChatGPT, Gemini, or Grok, it uses 10 to 50 times more energy than simple search on Google. Take a look at the electrification of Southeast Asia. Indonesia is at 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita. There's only 2 countries in Southeast Asia that are electrified at more than 10,000 kilowatt hour per capita. Those are Brunei and Singapore. Even Malaysia is only at 5,000, which is the highest of the rest. Philippines is still less than 1,000 kilowatt hour per capita. So the first base camp of modernity is really 6,000. If we were to calculate how much it would take for Southeast Asia to get to 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita, Southeast Asia would have to build a terawatt, which will cost, on a renewable basis, $2 to $3 trillion. Where's that money going to come from? Not from its domestic sources, at the rate that the fiscal space is so limited, with tax ratios ranging between 10 to 16%. And many of the large countries' monetary supply to GDP ratios are a lot less than 100%. Singapore is at more than 200%. So the way out of this is really FDI. But unfortunately, the FDI is only coming at a rate of $200 to $230 billion a year, of which Singapore gets about 100 to 140. Why? 2 things: rule of law and the translational wherewithal to translate from uncertainties to risks. Risks are oxygen to capital formation because they can be priced, they can be quantified. The other 9 or 10 countries, they don't have the wherewithal to translate from uncertainties to risks. Why? Because they don't have the STEM capabilities. They don't have the abilities to quantify, measure, predict, much less price. To the extent we can move the denominator up from 750,000 altogether to 2 million STEM products per year, I think we might have a much better chance for ASEAN to be able to pool that capital that's so prevalent and ubiquitous in the Western world. This dovetails back to the earlier reference. We have to look at the West more for economic capital allocation purposes at the rate that they're sitting on top of $140 trillion worth of liquidity. Now, China has been a capital allocator, but I think increasingly going forward more for technological purposes, not economic. And this is partly on the back of the dual circulation economic philosophy of Xi Jinping that would like to further domesticate its economic activities. Consequently, its capital or economic capital exportation capability will be somewhat reduced. So being able to look at China for technological capital purposes and the West for economic capital allocation purposes, I think it will serve Southeast Asia well in many respects, including our ability to not only be an enabler of AI, but a creator of AI, which will use much more energy than whatever we have today.
Thank you, Pak Gita. Again, very, very sobering and very, I think, important perspectives for people outside of the region to be hearing, especially here in the US, as well as the Chinese on this webinar. We do also have a few questions actually as it relates to Tokyo and Japan, especially with the new leadership. We've now on this panel, we've touched on how historically Japan has been both a stability anchor, but also a developmental partner to Southeast Asia. Question from Matthew, how do you see Japan as influencing China-ASEAN ties under Tokyo's new prime minister? And actually another question on how will trade and other relations between China, Korea, Japan, and India potentially develop, and how could that be of disadvantage to Southeast Asia? Perhaps I'm looking at Bert for this question.
Well, that's a lot to ask. We're a very new prime minister in Japan, but look, and she seems to have strong nationalist tendencies, but also having this view of Japan that has influence beyond Japan, and that is really something that re-emerged about 15 years ago. It was. Japan started to play a bigger role, not just economically, but also politically, say by the 1990s and then 2000. And then they disappeared for almost 2 decades because of their own economic troubles. And under sort of by 2010, they started to play a bigger role again. Now, the economic role has never disappeared. As I said, the economic role of Japan in Southeast Asia, in the whole of Asia, is actually still very, very strong. That may be a basis to which so that Japan can be not so much an alternative, but a co-leader in the East Asia sphere in terms of economics. And of course, that brings in the US. That has been largely absent diplomatically in Southeast Asia. They really dropped the ball by not having enough presence in Southeast Asia, not having enough economic alternatives for Southeast Asia. But Japan could, if you want, take up some of that slack, and putting Japan therefore in the Western camp. So a bit of a counterweight towards China. I'm sure that's how ASEAN countries themselves see Japan a little bit, that it could be a helpful friend in some of the issues that they're dealing with China.
Thank you, Bert. And with time running out, I had a last question, which is let's do very briefly to invite each of you to reflect on what you think what a future China-ASEAN partnership will look like. If you could perhaps give your answer in 30 seconds, what's one thing or one idea? And then also, if you have time in there to fit into it, what role should the US play in this evolving region for perhaps a more balanced and sustainable regional order? Bert, since you have your mic on, perhaps over to you first.
So, well, very briefly, I see that this relationship continues to strengthen. As the world fragmentizes, I believe that East Asia is going to be one of the 3 or 4 blocks that will emerge. How exactly that will happen depends very much on the US-China relationship. And as I said, even sort of by the end of this month, we will know whether it will be fast or gradual, that intensification of that relationship. Thanks.
Thank you, Bert. Perhaps over to you, Brian.
2 words. I think strategic empathy are absolutely vital. Large powers should seek to understand how smaller and medium powers think, their fears of infiltration, their fears of being interfered with, and the fears of being overdependent. The elites should learn to understand how the people think, no less because of the importance of understanding consumer preferences and tastes and how to avoid being overthrown by them. That aside, more importantly, because you cannot win over the hearts and minds of others' economies and consumer markets without understanding the people. And if all you engage with and end up talking to are just the elite, then that's just their contingent and fair weather support that you'd earn as opposed to respect of the people on the ground. And finally, empathy, I suppose, is vital for all of us trying to observe the region, whether it be from within or from the outside, because I find ASEAN such a fascinatingly heterogeneous and historically rich region. I've only scratched the surface of it, and yet I find myself sometimes listening to folks who opine in it as if they are the gurus and understand all there is about ASEAN, despite never having set foot upon it or having last visited it 20 years ago. I've seen the same problem occur to those who claim to be China watchers, so I would just say the same thing again. If you haven't been to the region in the past 10 years, you're probably not the most qualified expert on what's going on there today. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Over to you, Pak Gita.
Well, inequalities are rising. Polarization continues, if not worsens. That will only benefit the guys on the right, because the guys on the right, they campaigned on the back of intimidation. Whereas the guys on the left, they campaign with a message of hope. Unfortunately, message of hope requires credibility, whereas the right, they don't need credibility when they want to intimidate you, cause fear in you. So that's inevitable, globally speaking. Now, as it relates to Southeast Asia, we don't tell stories well. Unfortunately, now going forward, in order to tell stories which hopefully will embrace both literacy and numeracy, the onus is on all of us to actually increase our cognitive capacity so that we can better distribute cognitive capacity, so that we can improve marginal productivity, so that we can move up the value chain, so that we can move up the global geopolitical order. That is, I think, imperative. And the baseline is that we have peace and stability. Peace and stability is sine qua non to any kind of delta when it comes to economic development and how we're going to be able to embrace the global geopolitical order.
And that should be time for the panel. Thank you all. Well, thank you 3 all very much. And thanks to everyone who were able to join us and to also submit your questions. Sorry, we couldn't get to every one of them, but I hope this was a productive use of your time, whether in the morning or